Start.
Good to go.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Chris Nappy. I'm a natural resource officer in the town of Barnstable. Just letting you know, I'll be the hearing officer for today's aquaculture renewal hearing for Mr. Chris Gargiulo. So just a quick note at the beginning, just letting everybody know that this meeting's recorded, so everything you say is public record. As I stated, today is Tuesday, December 12th, 2023. The time is now 10:35 a.m. We're meeting for the aquaculture renewal hearing for Christopher Gargiulo of 309 Pine Ridge Road, Katuitt, Mass. 02635. And we're in the second floor of the Town of Barnstable Selectmen's Conference Room. So I'll just start by going through Chris's aquaculture license application, and then I'll take comment after that. And so I should just let everybody know that any comment that is provided during this hearing will go through me. It's not going to be a discussion back and forth, okay? Okay, so getting started. You can see all of everything that I'm about to go through is going to be shared up here on the screen. So, okay, what do we have here? Okay, so the approximate number of acres involved in this renewal application is 31.79. And it's comprised over 5 licensed sites, and all of these are within Katuitt Bay, so on the south side of town. The mean low water depth is, Chris notes here, it varies on each site, but it's plus or minus 1.5 feet to 3 feet, with a mean high water depth varies at each site of plus or minus 3 feet to 9 feet. The existing bottom conditions of the proposed area are mostly hard-packed sand. Some areas contain mud and or shell mix. The existing natural shellfish population are little to no natural shellfish on site, but some recruitment under bottom planted oysters of quahogs and razor clams exist. The species of shellfish to be cultivated are oysters and quahogs. Other species of shellfish cultivated are possibly scallops. Specific details of proposed methods of cultivation within the bottom culture, off bottom culture. He states here that oyster seed is purchased in the spring each year. That is typically 1.4 to 4 millimeters in size. This seed is grown in the flupsy upwellers until it reaches 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch in size. At this point, the seed is placed in floating gear, ADPI bags, and oyster grow cages until the oyster is approximately 1.5 plus inches. The seed is then bottom planted until it reaches market size. Oyster condo type cages, as well as custom stackable trays, are used to store market ready and sublegal oysters. Katuitt Oyster Company will continue to use the gear types described above, as well as any new gear types approved by the Town of Barnstable Natural Resources. For quahogs, 4 millimeter to 12 millimeter seed is purchased when available in the spring and early summer. Quahog seed is covered with 10x predator control netting until the seed is close to market size. The nets are removed and quahogs are harvested by rake or hydraulic dredge. Third page. Here. Third page. Oh, that got messed up. Okay. He proposes to harvest his shellfish by hand rakes, oyster dredge, hydraulic dredge for quahogs, boat with davit to lift cages. Predator control programs. He does institute scuba, traps, netting for quahogs, mesh bags for oysters. Is the proposed shellfish grant your sole means of support? He listed as 100%. Do you plan to employ any outside help in your operation? Yes. And the requested term for 10 years, which is standard. So then you can see there's the attached maps for each site within Katuitt Bay. So that's a pretty straightforward application. Chris, do you have anything else to add other than what's in your application?
No.
Okay. Natural Resources, Senior Natural Resource Officer Amy Crotos here. She's a shellfish constable. Do you have anything to add
So there were a number of letters of support that came in throughout the process of this renewal. You were provided with physical copies of them. We also have them all in the T drive for submission to the town manager. So that way they're all a part of the official record. I'm not sure if the intent is to read all of them or if you just kind of want to cover them.
Yeah, I guess I'll just briefly go through here because there's a number of them. It'll take me quite a long time to read all these letters. So we have one from the Mass Aquaculture Association. We have one from Mark Begley, who is an aquaculturist in town.
Chris?
Yes.
Excuse me. Would you just state the dates of each letter that was
Sure.
received? for the
Yes,
record?
so the Mass Aquaculture Association letter is dated December 11th of 2023. Mr. Begley's letter is dated December 9th of 2023. This is from Don Law and Sarah Molyneux of Old Post Road in Catuit, dated August 24th of 2023. This is dated from, this is from Matthew Walter, another one dated from August 29th of 2023. David Cherbuck from Catuit, August 30th of 2023, a letter of support. This letter is from Tom and Peter Burgess, dated August 30th of 2023. Another letter of support from John Noonan, dated August 30th, 2023. Letter in support from Marissa Kelly, dated August 29th, 2023. A letter from John Walter of Catuit from August 31st of 2023. A letter of support from the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. That's from Robert Rowe directly. That's September 5th of 2023. A letter from John Jackson, dated September 5th of 2023. A letter from Ted Titcomb, dated September 6, 2023. A letter from Dake Henderson from September 6, 2023. A letter from Dale Edmonds of September 9th, 2023. A letter of support from Richard and Sandra Nelson from November 30th of 2023. A letter of support from Pat Renahan. That's not dated. Do we have a date up there?
That one came in on the 8th.
From December 8th of 2023. A letter of support from Mia Walter from August 29th, 2023. A letter from Helly Smartwood, dated September 1st, 2023. That's what we have so far.
In addition, based on some complaints from the citizens group, we did get email confirmation from Army Corps of Engineers stating that Mr. Gargiulo is operating within what he's licensed to do through them. We have copies of both of his Army Corps permits, although we did not have copies of them previous to that request. And annually, I get a copy of his propagation permit from Division of Marine Fisheries. That also is included in that package, along with an email from Division of Marine Fisheries stating that Chris is operating within what he's permitted to do via them as well.
Okay, yeah, I have those emails here. It was directed to you from Christine Jasic from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. And like you said, and that's dated September 14th, 2023. Yeah, okay.
And then the same
And
for
then
Division of Marine Fisheries.
Division of Marine Fisheries provided a letter stating that Mr. Gargiulo is operating, within his limitations, and that's dated September 29, 2023.
Natural Resources doesn't have any opposition to a 10-year renewal of his aquaculture license for the 5 sites. Chris has had some gear changes over time, which he requested back in 2018 to start using oyster grows. That was approved in-house, didn't need extra review at the time. We don't think that extra review is warranted now either, given that this is a long-standing, well over 100-year operation. He's in compliance with all necessary paperwork required through Natural Resources in terms of annual reporting. He's up to date on all of his fees. And the Shellfish Committee, although nobody is here as a representative from it today, will be reviewing the renewal application at their meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m., also located here in the Selectmen's Conference Room. Recommendation from this hearing will not be forwarded to the town manager until after they've had an adequate chance to review the application.
Okay. Okay, so at this time, I'll take comment from anybody else that would like to provide one.
I have some comments, but
Could you state your name, please?
Sure. My name is Brian Wall. I'm an attorney. I have an office in Sandwich, and I represent what we're calling as the Residence Group, which is a group of 10 property owners on Oyster Harbors in West Island, Great Island. Before I begin, could I just ask a question about what was last stated? So our understanding is normally these hearings happen after the Shellfish Advisory Committee meets. So are you going to keep this hearing open until you receive that advice, or are you simply going to close and send it to the town manager?
Yeah, the hearing will close. It varies on when the hearings are held and when the Shellfish Committee meets. There's been times in the past where the Shellfish Committee hasn't had the opportunity to weigh in before the hearing because they either didn't have a quorum or didn't have a meeting for whatever reason. So, yeah, the hearing will close after today.
But as the hearing officer, don't you want their opinion before you make your recommendation?
Chris, you could do it that way. You could keep this open
Okay.
until after you get their input, if you think that that's important.
Sure, yeah, I mean, we can...
They're advisory, they're not.
Right. Yeah, it's an advisory committee, so we don't necessarily need their approval, but it's something that we can do if we feel.
And again, you're the hearing officer, but I would
Right.
respectfully suggest, the more information you have, the better, and to have a fair hearing.
I understand that, yeah. Yeah.
Also, I would ask, and I have a presentation, these are all points of information. I would ask that you keep it open for a second reason as well. I have a pre-prepared presentation, and when I prepared that, our information was that there was no federal permit, and we had done some very diligent investigation into that, and we've actually talked with the federal authorities after September 14th, which is the date that Officer Croto said the email came in, and we were informed after that date that the permit was not in the possession of the federal authorities. So this is new information to us, and we would like a fair opportunity to take a look at that before the hearing closes.
When you talk about federal authorities, you're referring to the Army Corps?
The Army Corps of Engineers,
Okay.
yeah. We've been in communication with them, and you'll see it from my presentation, because I obviously can't change the presentation now based upon information I just found out. But we had done some diligent communications, both public records requests, and talked with the federal authority up in Concord, and we were told that there was not a permit in the town's possession or in their possession. So this is brand new information as far as we're concerned.
Okay, yeah, I mean, they can't operate without a federal permit, so.
Exactly. I
So
understand.
they've had a federal permit.
Well, let's,
Right.
if you could hear me out.
Right, yeah.
We'll say,
And if I may not to, I apologize for the interruption, Brian, but I just want to be clear procedurally, if we're not going to close the hearing today, when all the presentations are done,
Right.
I would recommend that you continue to a date certain
Right,
to reconvene
right.
so that everybody will be aware when it does close. So it's a little bit of a nuisance in that respect.
Right.
But given the interest, it might be a good idea.
Okay.
and one further idea why we should do that too is we have been in communication with the town, and we were monitoring the town's website to find out when this hearing was, but we didn't get any advance notice, so I do apologize. I've come in with a letter with some information, which I would hope that you would look at. So if you can continue the hearing, you'll have a chance to do that. And I have an original for the record, and I brought Attorney Conley a copy as well, which I'll submit to the record. Having said that, with your permission, Mr. Hearing Officer, I do have an opening statement and a brief PowerPoint presentation, if I may.
Sure.
So
And that this PowerPoint has been provided, is that correct?
I have provided it. It's been loaded onto your computer, and I also provided a hard copy for the record.
That's this copy,
That's
right?
correct.
Okay.
So if I could just begin, my clients are aware of the fact that Kituit Oyster Company has been in business for many, many years. Our information is that in some shape or form it goes back to the 1800s. And this is an opportunity now, when it's up for a 10-year renewal, to hear a comment from the public and other interested parties. And as I said, we have tried to prepare for this hearing by looking into records at the federal government, at the town, at the state, et cetera. And with all due respect, my clients have developed the impression that the town is under the impression that Kituit Oyster is just conducting business as usual, and that everything is the same as in years past. And in fact, I heard the presentation going forward that, equipment has been approved and that didn't warrant further review. My clients respectfully disagree with that. And furthermore, they also feel that they're being stereotyped as wealthy waterfront property owners that just don't want to look at the aquaculture gear. And that's not true either. The concerns and objections go much deeper than that. So, for example, one of the points that I'm going to make today is my clients have observed a transformation in Kituit Oyster Company's operations over the past few years. We looked back at the 1995 renewal application, and at that time, Kituit Oyster was seeking, and I quote, "bottom culture employed on all grants, a minimum amount of floating tray culture for seed on grant number 3. But the current application seeks, and as the hearing officer read, that after the seed reaches a size of 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, the seed is placed in floating gear until the oyster is approximately 1.5 inches. Thus, this shows a transformation from complete on-bottom culture to a situation where every oyster that is being raised by Kituit Oyster spends some time now in floating gear. And that, in our opinion, is a major transformation. And it's not just in the methods. Our information shows that Kituit Oyster has substantially expanded its operations. There has been, in our view, and we're using data provided by Kituit Oyster, a 1,100% increase in the amount of above-water equipment from 2006 to 2023. And this change to above-water equipment and this increase in the intensity of the operations has caused new and different impacts that were not present before when it was on all-bottom culture. And the town's regulations contemplate such a situation and understand that there are multiple users and stakeholders in the 3 Bay area. The regulations provide that the size and scope of the license shall coexist with and not diminish other existing water-related activities. And we would respectfully submit that this change is causing impacts that warrant further review. And one of our requests is that the town take pause and look at what COC is doing, study it, and come up with conditions that would be fair and reasonable to all the property owners in the area and all the boaters in the area. In particular, we ask that the town consider looking at the Narrows, because the grant at the Narrows goes from shore to shore and has a length of about 2 football fields, I think. And obviously on-bottom culture there did not interfere with navigation, but above water culture does, because that's a very highly trafficked narrow area, that hence the name the Narrows. We would ask that you listen and consider these things, and also, as I mentioned, we also had information that the federal permit was not available. So if I may, Mr. Hearing Officer, I have a brief presentation that's going to further illustrate some of the things I've said in my opening statement.
Sure.
So I don't have the power to do the slides. Do you want me to, would it be okay? Just do I hit the arrows, thank you. So, as I said, Mr. Hearing Officer, I represent 10 property owners that have properties on North Bay Road and Sandpoint Road on Great Island. And we have a number of requests, and let me state clearly from the outset, my clients are not here today to try to say that Kituitt Oyster should not be in business. That's not even in the realm of what they want. What they're trying to say is there have been fundamental changes in the operation, and they're asking the licensing authority to take a look at that and come up with reasonable conditions that protect everybody's interests. So we're suggesting that the town investigate the change of operations, investigate the status of the federal permit. We also suggest that under your regulations, the license holder has to comply with all permits. And with this proliferation of above water equipment, we suggest that there may be a need for a mooring permit under Chapter 91, Section 10A, and we don't think that the license holder has those. And furthermore, we suggest that they require wetlands permits, which they don't have as well. And finally, the request is to have reasonable conditions that address these new and different operations that are occurring. And as I mentioned, the residents group has observed significant changes in COC's operations, a significant increase in the amount of equipment, the use of new and different above water equipment, and equipment in new locations that it never was before, including in the Narrows. And I have some photos that demonstrate this. This area of above floating bags, my clients have observed it grow over the years west of Great Island. This is a photo of some new and different locations of where the cages are, and it's new and different. And I know Mr. Gargiulo is here. He might want to chime in and explain what the cages are doing flipped up in the air and in the boat.
I would say when you're done with your comment, we can take additional comment
Okay,
from other
thank
people.
you. And these are the new types of cages that we're observing, and I heard Officer Croto say that they were approved in 2018, but they are very different than what was there previously, particularly the on-bottom culture that was out of sight and out of mind. These cages are not out of sight and not out of mind, and they're large. I went to the website for the oyster grow, and you can see that they're consisting of black floating plastic that suspend the cages underneath. And what we have observed, or my clients have observed, is a new technique for anti-fouling. What we've observed, and that's the cages we think back here, is if you look at what they do, they come and they take the bags out of the cages, and then they flip the oyster grow pontoon structure upside down and allow the sun to beat down on the empty cages to do the anti-fouling, which is a very different kind of activity than has ever occurred before. This photo or photos show the new and different locations where the equipment has been showing up. It's extremely close to shore. It's between existing docks. In our calculation of looking at information that we found through public records, particularly a 2006 inventory that was filed by Kituitt Oyster, versus more recently, if you look at this email here, a few months ago, we were asking for information about the increase in equipment, and Officer Croto wrote to Mr. Gargiulo and asked for an inventory. And I know I highlighted the quote, "if any," and I'm not casting aspersions here, but I'm just suggesting there's kind of a complacency that the town just thinks that it's normal operations out there, that nothing's different. So Officer Croto asked for information regarding new equipment, and she said, "if any." But if you look at the inventory that was provided and compare it to the 2006 inventory, the numbers are right there. And these aren't our numbers. These are Kituitt Oyster's numbers. The bags have gone from 329 to 3,550, and that's a 1,100% increase. And more notably, too, they've also appeared in grant areas that they were not before. For example, in grant area 4, it went from 0 to 92. And in grant area 3, it went from 119 to 760. Grant 2, 65 to 2,618. We would respectfully submit to you as the hearing officer that this is a substantial change and a substantial increase in the equipment. And the points that I'm making here is that this is a fundamental transformation over a couple of decades to what used to be there. As I mentioned in my opening, the 1995 renewal application said, quote, "Bottom culture is employed on all grants. A minimal amount of floating tray culture for seed on grant 3. We contemplate no change in operation in the foreseeable future." But it's been renewed and renewed and renewed, and now today, the current application before you is to place seed in floating gear until the oysters grow to 1.5 inches and then bottom planted. It's a complete change from their prior operation. And it's also an expansion. Their planting records indicate that in 1995, approximately 1 million seed were planted. In 2023, more than 4,500,000 seed was planted. And these, as I mentioned, have changed the impacts that have been experienced by the property owners. It's affected the use and enjoyment of the waterfront, the recreational use of the water, boating, navigation, access to docks, scenic vistas and views, and frankly, property values. These are not just mere complaints. There's a legal basis for this. The state statute that allows grants to be given in the first place authorizes grants so as not to impair the private rights of any person or to materially obstruct navigable waters. Your regulations echo that. Your regulations require there to be a minimal or minimize the impact on other uses of the environment. It recognizes the right of the public to navigate through a license, and further that the size and scope shall coexist with and not diminish other existing water-related activities. And the Barnstable regulations also require compliance with all of the laws, rules, and regulations. Our contention is that there's non-compliance with MGL Chapter 130, Section 57. How? The next bullet down tells you. Waterfront property owners have rights that are different than upland landlocked property. When one owns waterfront property, they have what's called littoral rights, which are rights to access the water from their property and to access their property from the water. It's the same statute in which dock licenses and mooring permits are given. My clients contend that the placement of equipment near shore and near existing docks is impairing their private littoral rights in violation of Chapter 130, Section 57, and the new floating equipment is materially obstructing navigable waters. And here's a few photos that show how. It's very, very close to existing docks and existing boats. Sometimes the equipment comes loose and interferes with private property and smashes into the boats and the docks. And again, it's very, very close in obstructing the ability to freely navigate through the licensed area. Again, completely different than the on-bottom culture when the boats could simply go right over what was on the bottom. Your regulations, again, allow the town to limit the size and the scope of the license or condition it so as to coexist with other activities. And we would respectfully submit, as shown in the pictures, that this license is not coexisting with other water-related activities. And your wetlands regulations, also adopted by town meeting and as adopted by your Conservation Commission, protect recreational activities for the public in the water. And I've highlighted that those include non-commercial fishing, shell fishing, hunting, boating, swimming, hiking, walking, painting, bird watching, and aesthetic enjoyment. And again, the pictures speak for themselves. And the regulation also protects against cumulative effects. And as I've mentioned, the expansion of this license is a cumulative effect that's having an adverse impact on those protected rights and interests. To segue to a different part of, I'm sorry, I have a few more slides. This issue has come up twice, as far as we could tell, in the town before. In 2007, there were 2 applications for new licenses in Pompanesett Bay, and those applicants sought to have above water gear, and the town reviewed those in depth, and I've provided copies of these decisions in the letter that I've submitted. And the touchstone characteristic that seemed to be objectionable was the above water nature of the equipment. And the town denied both of those applications for numerous reasons, some of which I've pulled out and put up on the slide, that aquaculture near shore obstructs navigation. These are the town's findings, so these aren't my arguments. These are the findings the town made previously. Aquaculture near shore is visible from shore and impacts scenic vistas. Aquaculture excludes use of areas for boating, fishing, shellfishing, kayaking, swimming, and passive recreational activities. The floating bags affect the benthic area underneath, and the floating equipment excludes the public from the water sheet. And there's case number 1, and there's also case number 2, essentially the same things. And what we would respectfully submit to you is that that is what's happening here, and I'm going to use the phrase under the radar, that slowly but surely Kituitt Oyster is starting to put out these above water bags and above water structures, and they're slowly but surely transforming their operation in a fundamental way that changes the impacts. And we would respectfully submit that the reasons for denial of those other 2 decisions in 2007 are exactly the same here and are applicable here. As I've argued here, the bags affect recreational navigation, views, scenic vistas, littoral rights. They adversely affect tax assessments. And again, all of these impacts are amplified by the fact that there's been a 1,100% increase in the use of the water sheet. The second part of my presentation has to do with the compliance with all laws. So this is rather detailed, but I think it's important to go through because I want to make sure we're all on the same page about the existence of the federal permit. Our research indicated that in 1991, the Army Corps issued to COC a letter of permission, otherwise known as an LOP. The LOP is a generalized grant of permission that sets forth certain rules and regulations and guidelines about conducting aquaculture in the public water. But it also specifically says that the letter of permission is not a permit. There has to be a separate, specific permit that's issued to the licensee. And in this case, our public records requests indicated that the Army Corps sent Kituitt Oyster such a letter in 1992 saying that they had issued authorization. However, the letter states that the authorization was limited to deploy and maintain racks, grow-out areas, and marker buoys in Kituitt Bay in Shellfish Grant number 3. And our research indicates that racks are underwater gear. So our research indicates that there's no authority under the federal permit for above water gear. Furthermore, we asked for the permit, and you can see here, I put up on the screen, and this is all part of the letter that I've submitted. The letter of permission specifically says, enclosed is a copy of the permit setting forth applicability and conditions. But our communications with the federal authorities are, they don't have the permit. They said that the town has the permit. We asked the town for the permit, and the town said that it does not have the permit. My clients asked Kituitt Oyster to provide the permit, and they refused to provide a copy. So our due diligence has indicated that there's no permit, and that's why when I heard the presentation earlier today, that's all news to me, and we would like the opportunity to see what that permit says, because we want to make sure it's valid, we want to make sure it has the terms and conditions spelled out, and we want to make sure that Kituitt Oyster is in compliance with those conditions. And even without the permit, the letter of permission itself, that overriding document, provides conditions that we would respectfully suggest are being implicated by the change in Kituitt Oyster's operations. Those are set up on the screen as follows. Number 16, there shall be no unreasonable interference with navigation by the existence or use of the activity authorized. And 19, no attempt shall be made to prevent the full and free access by the public of all navigable waters at or adjacent to the authorized activity. So again, we think that this above water equipment is interfering and not complying with these conditions. So this slide, my presentation is a little off because of the new information, but our contention is that it's vitally important that we find out if Kituitt Oysters has a valid federal permit and if it's in compliance with those terms and conditions, because without the federal permit, Kituitt Oyster is not in compliance with Barnstable's regulations. And if there is a federal permit, we need to know if it authorizes above water equipment and what terms and conditions. And finally, Mr. Hearing Officer, the point I made in my opening, I put up Section 10A on the screen from Chapter 91. Chapter 10A authorizes floats and rafts that are anchored by bottom anchors, but they require a permit from the harbor master, and without a permit, they're considered a public nuisance. And I would respectfully submit that a boat owner can't just go put a mooring anywhere they want. They have to clear it with the harbor master to make sure that there are no impacts on navigation or private property interests. And our experience and observations are that Katuitt Oyster is just putting the floats wherever they want to and are not considering the other implications. And therefore, we would suggest that there needs to be an investigation to see if there's a 10A permit. And further, the wetlands regulations require permits for any activity in a wetland resource. And the regulations specifically regarding land containing shellfish contains a phrase that says aquaculture may be permitted. And I would submit to you that that means they require a permit. And our research again indicates that there's no permit under the Wetlands Act. That's my presentation. I'm available for questions, and I would ask that you consider this information. My client, Mr. Cosgrove, who's also an attorney, would like to make a few comments as well, and I think he has a PowerPoint as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that comment and presentation, Mr. Cosgrove.
Can you hear me okay if I speak here?
Yeah, yes, right into the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for your service to the town. My name is Barry Cosgrove, and I wanted to try to offer what I view as some more business-like common sense approaches to how you might think about this as you make your decision. First and foremost, I don't think you'd find a group of people that are more pro-free enterprise than this group. But we're also very pro-respecting the town mission, which clearly spells out equitable balances for all residents. And it's not an easy task when you have competing interests, but it is, after all, the fundamental mission of the town. And the Sound Shellfish Law does the same thing. It talks about the appropriateness and the urgency of orderly development and minimizing impacts and coexisting. And we're all for that. And it talks about no diminishing of water rights. And the Shellfish Association of East Coast, they make it even more clear that it is a grower's obligation to operate the farm respecting other stakeholders. In our view, dealing with stakeholders and saying, hey, I got a permit, talk to the town, or acting in a way that, well, I have a permit, so I have diplomatic immunity, is not the way to run a railroad. I want to talk about grant areas 2 and 4, which is right in that Narrows area where Isabella Point is one end and heading towards the opposite direction towards the headquarters of the company. There's no doubt about it that these 2 grants, approximating 17, 18 acres, if I did the math right, basically swallow up one of the busiest, most active stretches of water on all of Cape Cod. It is an extraordinarily dynamic area. 450 plus boats are parked right down the street. Most of them come through there one direction or another. It's a funnel. And there have been extraordinary growth and changes there since these grants were issued. Grants area 2 and 4 are now really illogical, if you think about it. And this is where our interests and the Katuitt Oyster Company's interests are actually more aligned, if you really think about it. And here's why. If we were sitting here today asking for the first time, would you put this size grants in that narrow area I think it wouldn't happen. I don't think that the Katuitt Oyster Company, if they had their choice, would necessarily be right there. But when they were originally issued, the area wasn't as developed as it is now. So the question becomes whether really this makes sense as an area whatsoever in the interest of the grower himself, where this is obviously making it tougher for him to do business. At the bottom of this is the actual description of the Narrows, if there's anybody that had any question about that. So we look at fundamental supply and demand. We have a Katuitt Narrows area that's called the Narrows for good reason. The permitting review today needs to be conducted, we say, respectfully, in recognition of its suitability and adaptability to today's conditions. The notion that somebody's had a permit since the Pilgrims landed is completely irrelevant to a thoughtful, sensible evaluation of the area as it exists now. Demand to the moon. Supply has gone way down because of the surface coverage. So the key question for us is, how do we fix the oyster or the elephant in the room? We're going to keep shoehorning and kicking the oyster down the road, or help this business and help these owners come up with some smart ideas? Let me put it into perspective. Suppose we were not here talking about this application. Suppose we came in and we said, we would like to have a permit for 2 acres right in the Narrows, a ball above water. Everybody in this room knows we'd be laughed out of the room. No way. Suppose then we were here today to say, hey, we would like to put in a 78,000 square foot above water floating dock-like structure in the Narrows. That would be the application. And again, you'd say you're out of your mind. But in point of fact, this is exactly what you are being asked to approve. 17 to 18 acres times 43,500 square feet to an acre is the available square footage this applicant has. The maximum they can use is 10%. They're in effect asking for 78,000 square feet of above water stuff that would never in a million years be approved today, whether it be for a dock, a float, or anything else. That's the common sense thing that you got to think about. And you can't make that decision, in our view, by saying, well, they've always had the permit. That's not the way you do it. If you see something's changed, you need to adapt and think about whether there's a smarter way to do it. Now, luckily for the town, it's had to deal with this in the past. How do you balance this notion of a private business operating for a pecuniary interest on property it doesn't own? And there's actually some very recent precedent that could be helpful as you make your decision. For example, this criteria was reviewed, again, as an analogy, when they just had the decision to make about where you place life-saving equipment for internet connectivity on public land. And what the town very wisely did is they thoughtfully reviewed the whole thing, they came up with 34 pages of regulations. And nothing against oysters, but here we have the town saying even for life-saving equipment that allows people to call 911, to get a job, to get health care, to get mental health care, even that stuff on public land needs to be respectful of the neighbors. And again, I'm not knocking oysters, but oysters don't save lives. So one of the things that the town has done is they say, hey, look, let's at least try to avoid locations directly in front of a residential dwelling. We don't do it here. Separate 100 feet from a residential dwelling because it's considered unsightly. Doesn't appear to be that thinking here. You have to disclose hazardous products. We've talked to the manufacturers of this equipment toward one of their facilities. Every one of them are loaded with PFAS plastics. Every one of them. Now, there's great debate in the science about whether it means anything, but if given the choice, you'd think you want to avoid it. There are other examples that you can turn to. When you look at floating gear criteria, for example, with docks, With a dock, you can't restrain public use. You have to be able to let people go over it and go under it. Can't do that with these. With docks, you have to have anti-fouling requirements. These aren't anti-fouling requirements. Fouling is one of their biggest problems. It's not their fault, that happens. Docks have to have lights. These have no lights. Docks aren't supposed to attract birds. These things are restaurants for birds and bathrooms. And when you talk about docks, you say minimize shadowing. All this equipment does the same thing. When you look at the town's other examples, they say avoid obstructions, put safety first, and there should be indemnification and insurance. This application addresses none of that. None of it. In fact, this company has opposed docks. And the criteria they use is it's bad precedent and it attracts fouling. What's the difference? And if it's bad precedent, then that ought to be a consideration in your decision, because why shouldn't any other farmer come in here tomorrow and say, I want to go above water as well? The 2007 decisions that were mentioned talked about aesthetics and important to considering the area. You talk to people that go through there, they don't say, wow, that's nice. They say, what the hell is that? So the question is, what's the difference? Why isn't the same logic deployed in these other examples applied here? Other examples in terms of how far they're spaced out. Look at that photograph. I mean, they're just shoehorned everywhere. The density and scale should matter. That area has changed. Would you allow moorings like this? And this is a whole other issue, but I hope someone in the town's paying attention to it. The town is making nothing on this, a pittance. And I ask this, what if Katuitt Oyster Company took all their gear out of the water and put it in the street they live on and blocked people's driveways, inability of kids to play in the street, made a mess? How would that be treated? What's the difference? It'd be considered blight, I think. Now this, I think, is the most important photograph in the whole thing. I'll try to explain it as a non-fisherman. The town has said in many places that you need to assess availability of feasible alternatives, okay? It's a sensible criteria. Now, Katuitt Oyster Company says we can't go out on the bottom. Well, here you can see right here, they're double dipping. They're going on the bottom and on the top. And they said, well, we got to float. We got to float everything. Now, notice these guys, and maybe it's this gentleman right here. They're not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They're barely up to their waist. It's low tide, of course. So the question we ask, and when we talk to the manufacturers of this equipment, brought a little sample with you. You guys don't need to know this, I suppose, but just to make the point, if you've got gear that's floating on the top, and the cages are about a foot, say, down into the bottom, and at low tide, if you just did it this way, which the gear is allowed to do, all you do is undo the cap, you sink it, so that the cage is a foot off the bottom. What's the difference? The delta is like about 12 to 14 to 20 inches. And we asked the marine scientists, is there really a big difference in temperature, turbidity, visibility, flow, nutrients? And the answer we get back is there'd be a little more nutrients on the top, definitely. Probably a little more wave action on the top. But the point is the difference between putting it here and putting it here, here off the bottom, or here, when the delta is this, to create all this havoc, it just doesn't seem to make any common sense. The equipment has been designed to find a happy medium. Now, we recognize this is easy. These guys pull the boat up, they flip it over, they go home, we have to live with it, they come back, they flip it back. You do it this way, it's a headache. You got to drain the water again, pull it up, clean it off. People do it successfully all over the world. And there isn't any evidence that shows that they can't succeed this way. Would the oysters grow a little slower? Yeah, they would. They would. Would this be fouling? They're going to be fouling anywhere. And the next question has to do with optionality. Now, down here, and again, this is, again, taken from your town examples when they were allowing people to use public property. Do you have options, and here there clearly are options. Down there at areas 6 and 7, approximating 15 acres, they say, well, we already use that on the bottom. Well, what about the optionality of it? What about using some of that? Then the answer comes up, say, well, we don't like to do that because they get a sailing class down there. Well, let me tell you about a sailing class. One day this summer, these kids were doing this sailing thing, and they were tackling through the Narrows, which, as the harbor master here would know, is a busy spot. So boats are going both directions. These little kids are tacking, so it's crazy, okay? 2 kids tip over. Myself and another guy go out and paddle boat. We're trying to go directly to them. You can't because those things are in the way. The adults that were with them had, luckily, those, what do you call them? Hedges, or the hitches that allowed them to pull the kids' boats and drag them. But when they tried to drag them to get them out of the way, what do you think they ran into? So these things have taken away safety valves. They have taken away a roadside, to use an example. They couldn't get out of there. The waves were, then one kid reaches up to hold on to one of the cages, and as you guys know, in the water, those things will move pretty easily. It didn't help the situation whatsoever. Now, the story we get, our belief is it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. The real way is that this is the preference to do things. This is they want to keep the status quo. They like the way they do things. And we're businessmen. We understand that. If something works, you like to stick with it. But this is different. They're given a privilege, not a right, to use public property. They're not growing apples on their own property. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's faster, more grow, more dough. It's money. But here's the question that I'm completely lost on. Money's driving the thing. We all know it is. It is cheaper to operate the way they're doing. It reduces your labor. But why? Where's the results? We looked at the state and natural seed to market village survival rates, and there's lots of variability, particularly with what size seed you start with. But a local study in 2022 showed that 68% is the average. This guy, Bill Walton, local guy, went down to Auburn. I don't know if he's back now or not, but his public statement is if you're getting less than 70%, you're doing something wrong. That's not a criticism of Katuitt Oyster Company. It's a question of whether that's the right location. Why are you fighting for the right location? Now, Katuitt Oyster Company submits its production under oath, and they're down at 29%. So if I were here in my usual job and I'm reviewing a branch operation, and I see a business where the neighbors aren't happy, production's way below average. In fact, it's 30% below what it was years ago when they didn't use above gear, according to the documents they submitted to the town under oath. So repeat, when they didn't use above gear, they had better turn than they have with the new gear. And add to this, and this is the real head scratcher, in Area 4, Grant 4, this is an area that's fecal infested seasonally, yet 9,000% increase in floats in the same area, closed to shellfishing. A kid can't even take a souvenir out of there. Again, I got all my permits. We asked them for the permits, and they responded and said, I'm not going to give them to you. So we asked the town, do you have them? Nope. We asked the feds. Well, we have the letter of permission, but the actual permit we gave to the operator and to the town. And this feel-good slogan about 50 gallons of oysters being cleaned a day, we've spoken to many marine biologists about this, and it's simply not accurate. It can't be a basis to say that we should keep doing this way. Depends on the size of the oyster, time of the year, depth of the water, a ton of stuff. But they do eat some stuff, and that's great. But they forget the fundamentals of math, which is whatever you do on one side of the equation, you got to do on the other. So if you're going to talk about what the oyster eats up, you got to talk about what the oyster contributes. And we'll leave with you today a study from the Mass Coastal Zone Management Department that had some really nasty figures about how much waste is produced by oysters, how much seagulls sitting on top of the bags produce, and in a study by Portnoy and Renewal, that it's basically aquatic physics. The idea being that it's not a very good idea to have the dispelling material from the oysters floating into the water, because then it gets in the waterway and it splatters out like salt and pepper shaker if you hung it out of a plane, versus closer to the surface where the materials can oxygenate it and can be dispelled nitrogen better. So some pretty smart people have thought about this. They're really raising the question, is it a cause or is it a solution? And again, why isn't this an application, a peaceful, joint, cooperative effort by the neighbors and this business to see if there aren't some smart alternative locations, some smart alternative, sensible realignment of how they do things? We said, hey, can you just help out a little bit, a couple, 3-4 months of the year in some of the areas? Nope, not the way I want to do it. It can be done. They have the equipment's designed for it, the available options are there. But we're NIMBY. We're not NIMBY. Nothing we propose would take a single oyster out of the water. Our view is you could get more oysters in there. And it's not in our backyard, it's in our front yard. And the property value impacts in this are real, and there are studies on that as well. We asked some kids in high school, we said, hey, can you come up with an acronym that would be the inverse of NIMBY but using the same letters? This is what they came up with. Is that NIMBYism or reckless indifference? Oh, but we'll move them for you. We know they're an eyesore, but we'll move them for you if you're having a wedding. More NIMBYism? There are multiple unanswered questions here. There's some open investigations. There's questionably missing permits unless they've got them today and now they're going to disclose them. It would be unimaginable to close this hearing without further investigation. Unimaginable not to condition the permit with some sensible guardrails as a town has utilized in other areas. Why don't we bring in a mediator? Why don't we bring in a professional, sit down, see if we can come up with some good ideas that may actually help these guys? It's always a case of putting the puzzle together. We need a peck of common sense. I've listened to many of the shellfish meetings, and we talk about how closely they monitor the residential recreational people. You can take a half peck here and a half peck there, here a peck, everywhere a peck. Meanwhile, we got millions of oysters that don't appear to be regulated nearly as carefully. There's equipment optionality, there's location optionality, there's seasonal optionality, there's legitimate rights of others, there's a way to work together with guardrails, and we believe a revenue expansion opportunity. Again, bringing a media would be more than happy to try to work together to come up with some smart ideas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir, for bringing up those points. At this point, I'll take comment from anybody else that'd like to provide some.
If there's no one else, I'd like to speak unless there's someone else other than Christopher. You folks? Or you want me to go? For the record, my name is Edward Gargiulo. I'm here really wearing 4 hats. One, I'm a year-round resident of Cotuit. 2, I'm a long-time, many-year supporter and customer of the Cotuit Oyster Company. Thirdly, I'm Christopher's uncle. And fourthly, I'm the counsel, and my law firm is counsel on behalf of the Cotuit Oyster Company. I would suggest to you that the more reliable evidence that's available to you is the scrutiny that Cotuit Oyster and Aquaculture operation is under and has been under from both the town of Barnstable, the feds, the state, and others. And that scrutiny and those, to suggest that there aren't observations made of the operations of Cotuit Oyster Company on a regular basis by some of the people even in this room is, frankly, I would suggest misleading. To show a few photographs, one I'm personally familiar with, there's a repeated showing of a photograph of some gear that had broken loose and was on a neighbor of, I believe, Mr. Cosgrove's. And Christopher got a call. As it happened, we were together. and I was with him, and within 40 minutes, we were both down there in a skiff, moving that gear that had suffered a broken, large shackle due to some very excessive winds that day. I would suggest to you they only showed one such occurrence because, to my knowledge, that's the only one that's occurred in recent times. So I would suggest to you the scrutiny of the various agencies that are involved in a highly regulated business, farming, is much more reliable to you than if you cherry-picked photographs. This process and these objections started back in the spring, is my recollection. And they started with the gentleman at the table there, Mr. Cosgrove. And at that time, he made similar suggestions, and his objection really was to the eye-scape. He didn't like looking at the floating gear. In fact, at that time, and there would be testimony under oath available if necessary, at that time he would have been perfectly content and so offered to withdraw his objection if the gear in front of his house was moved in front of a neighbor's, which was declined. And frankly, that I would suggest to you would indicate to me, and did at the time, that his objection, and it was only his at that time, was grounded in the visual objections he had to looking at the gear. Well, I would suggest to you that clearly, fortunately, we have a statute in the state called, if I remember correctly, Mass General Laws 243, Section 6. It's the right to farm. And the right to farm protects farmers from nuisance complaints by neighbors, abutters, those affected. Aquaculture, by virtue of statute, I believe 241, clearly falls within farming within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the Cotuit Oyster Company clearly, the right to farm in Massachusetts applies to the Cotuit Oyster Company. I would suggest to you the evidence, if it were examined in a process under oath, would demonstrate that this is all about a eye-scape, a viewscape, that these folks on that side of the Narrows, and now he's managed to recruit some others, although they're not here, nor do I see much evidence from them in support. And in fact, we've had a number of folks in Barnstable heavily supporting the Cotuit Oyster Company and very upset about what some of their fellow Barnstable residents are saying about the Cotuit Oyster Company. But long and short of it is, I would suggest to you that the real issue here is the eyesore issue. So the right to farm law, in my view at least, applies. The rest has been a thinly veiled effort to cloak that problem. And I noticed Mr. Cosgrove slipped and mentioned eyesore once in his presentation. I suggest to you that's the real objection. And hence the last-ditch, hallelujah effort relative to a alleged lack of the Army Corps of Engineers permit, which is not true. We have the permit. The permit is in existence. It's been defined. It's been, to my knowledge, it's been looked into by the town of Barnstable, and I believe if the town doesn't have copies, we're happy to give them to them. It is not our job to provide folks that are trying to intentionally and maliciously interfere with our business, my nephew's business. It's not our job to assist them in that process. And hence why they were provided with various documents. And Mr. Cosgrove, before he retained counsel, made requests for all kinds of documents. But it wasn't our job to give him the bullets to put in a gun to try to shoot at us. That's his business. So I would suggest to you this is really about an eyesore nuisance. When you pull all the nonsense away that they try to window dress it with, that's what it's about. And that brings you to the science and back to the statute, because the statute's very clear. Fortunately, our legislators, perhaps in a not too frequent exercise of some foresight and knowledge up in Beacon Hill, saw that things change, and things and practices change, and gear changes in farming. So it's written into the statute. I don't have it in front of me, but I'm sure counsel on behalf of the town is familiar with it and can be, and provide whatever counsel you folks need. But it does clearly contemplate changes in technology and gear and use and practices. And it talks about, as long as it's, what's being done is customary, is something that the industry recognizes as a proper use, then it's covered. And that's exactly what you have here. You've had, Mr. Wall cites some 1995 figures, which by my arithmetic is some 28 years ago. And I don't know that they even had floating gear 28 years ago. I don't know if anybody had invented it. I would suggest to you perhaps not at that time. So like other activities, aquaculture has evolved, and new gear has come up. And growers have used it and tried it, and some things have worked, whether they're those Chinese hats or whether they're floating gear or whatever it happens to be. And that is their right, and our legislature contemplated that right in their drafting of Mass General Laws 243, Section 6. So I would suggest to you, and that brings me to the science, which is frankly, what was presented here today, in my view at least, was I'll call it junk science. I'll call it Google search internet science. We did not hear from a board-certified, qualified expert who had gone and taken samples and could talk about bottom contamination, or strike that, bottom growth, various types of seaweed that I certainly can't name, sponge, what are those things called? Boring sponges, all these various things that affect aquaculture and affect farming and are very technical. So to suggest that somehow basically a Google search presentation is reliable evidence, I would suggest you would be laughed out of a courtroom. There is no presentation here from a certified expert, and I would suggest to you if there was, it would have supported the Cotuit Oyster Company. I think you do have photos of the boring sponges and the grass, and I think by virtue of anyone who goes out there and looks at the bottom and what comes up on a scallop drag or what comes up on gear can see clearly that that's why certain locations are more suitable and can be used where others cannot. And, that's whether, I would suggest to you it's akin to farmland and a pasture where lowland is better for some item to grow and higher, less perhaps drier land is better for something else to grow. Apparently with agriculture it is no different. We haven't produced an expert for you. We don't think we need one. We think the town, the state, and the feds all have more than the ability, knowledge, et cetera, to understand what we're talking about and recognize from the photos and from their own physical examinations that the Cotuit Oyster Company has to make decisions based on particular to the locations, and they'll use gear that will work for them in those locations. There is nothing, I would suggest to you, inordinate about floating gear. It's highly being utilized up and down the East Coast and elsewhere. And it's necessary to keep the Cotuit Oyster Company viable and operating. I would suggest to you one of the nicest letters I saw, and I did not read them all, was Dick Nelson's. I've known Dick Nelson for probably 50 years or more. He had the Cotuit Oyster Company from the 70s until my nephew got involved with him and bought it. Prior to that, he rode as a boy with his father from Long Island and watched spat being shoveled off a vessel under sail that his father had sold to the then owners of the Cotuit Oyster Company. So Dick truly has that bay and that company in his blood and in his soul. And he referred to Chris and what he's doing as a stewardship, as being steward to the Cotuit Oyster Company. And that meant a lot to me because that's exactly what Christopher at this stage is. He's the steward to the Cotuit Oyster Company. And He may own it, he may manage it, but more importantly, he's a steward to an institution that is iconic, not just in our village and in our town and in our area, but in the country. And I frankly would suggest to you that he has done an incredibly good job. And it's unfortunate that a group, and talk about NIMBY all they want, but they were very quick to describe themselves when they threatened my nephew as, quote, a group, you don't want a group of billionaires all over you, do you? And that's exactly what was said to him, and if it ever came to it, we'd have testimony to that effect. So I find it personally offensive to suggest otherwise. And to suggest mediation at this time is not something we're interested in, because we don't believe we're doing anything incorrectly. And we believe that we are in compliance with all the regulations, state, federal, et cetera. And I believe Christopher has been a very good steward to the Cotuit Oyster Company. Has he been interested in trying to balance everyone's interests? I think one of the letters is actually from the Cotuit, it's actually the Cotuit Mosquito Yacht Club, which is the oldest children's sailing club in the United States. And I think Jay Spence, if he's not now, he was president of that, or his wife Natalie was, wrote a letter on behalf of their membership in support of the Cotuit Oyster Company. And in fact, if it actually got more heated, I think you'd see the village of Cotuit gather pitchforks and torches in favor of the Cotuit Oyster Company, and for right reason. So I think the gentleman from Osterville should be thankful that Christopher has tried and will continue to try to operate his business in a way that does not adversely affect the use of those docks. And by the way, some of those docks have vessels on them that exceed the permitted size of the vessels. Additionally, if it were measured, and perhaps it has been by the town, the gear is more than adequately distant from any dockage so that one can easily approach, egress, come and go from a dock, unless they are incompetent navigators and boat operators. Has he been concerned with the sailors? Yeah, he has. His dad, my brother, was a longtime sailor and sailed all over that bay. And is he trying very hard, and will continue to balance everyone's interests? I think anyone who has dealt with him, other than those that don't want this ice-scape, this problem, to look out from their home, I think anyone else, hence the support, would agree that he's done a very good job and worked very hard to earn the respect of his community and his customers. And I think anyone who looks at that company and looks at him knows that it isn't driven by some overriding profit motive, which may drive many folks, but not necessarily him. But yet it does move along, and it's in the black, and he hopes to keep it in the black. And he likes to think that the town of Barnstable sees him as a partner, not as an interloper, not as someone taking advantage of something for free, but someone who's working his butt off and providing jobs for people and providing a product that a lot of people care about and enjoy, and doing so in a way that is respectful of all of those around him. So I frankly would ask you to consider all of those factors, and I would ask you to weigh the evidence and its reliability as you might if you were examining it in a courtroom. And I think you'll find most of it is rhetoric and talk and not supported. And if the data's produced, this data is general data. It does not, it can't be applied to a particular location in a particular bay at a particular time of year or era of time, such as now versus 20 years ago. For all those reasons, I can't speak more strongly in favor of the support of the Cotuit Oyster Company. And I think my nephew probably has some comments on some of the more technical stuff that I do not have command of.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gargiulo. Chris, do you have anything to add?
There was a few things that stood out to me, and I think a lot of it is just the lack of knowledge about the industry. You know, when Dick Nelson ran this business, there was not as many hatcheries that are available at this time. He had to buy a very large seed in order to grow an oyster on the bottom here in Katuitt. So he was buying basically sublegal oyster seed and then putting it on the bottom and harvesting it. And he struggled year after year. He dealt with, you know, MSX blights and dermal blights through the 90s, which completely wiped him out at least twice that I know of. And I know the devastating effects that that had on the business and him personally. So as time moved on, hatcheries were able to develop and grow seed at a smaller size, and they were able to provide it to growers so that they weren't relying on a large sublegal seed to grow in the bay. So most people over time adapted to, okay, well, I'm going to get this smaller seed, it's more viable. I need equipment that's going to be able to contain it, to protect it from predators. How do we go about doing this? So subtidal area, which is where we are in Katuitt Bay, is not the same as an intertidal site on the north side or Wellfleet or any of these other spots. We have different challenges. When I first got involved with this business, I thought I'd go up and visit a friend in Wellfleet and rubber stamp that operation here in Katuitt. I built 350 rebar racks. I had them deployed on all the sites. And I learned pretty quickly that having a rack underwater all the time with no drying time created a disaster in terms of, you know, a bag that contained sea squirts, boring sponge, barnacles, etc. All the fouling organisms that impact the ability for an oyster to grow and have a marketable product. So at that time, Dick Nelson happened to have a bag called a Papalardo bag, which was a 5-foot-long floating bag. Real rudimentary design, but he had them, and I used them. And what I learned really quickly was that by using that system, I was able to eliminate some of the challenges that I had subtidally. Dick had experimented with floating trays, as he suggested in 1995, and even prior to that. He used to literally take pine strapping and nail mosquito mesh to it and use that to contain seed. Floating bags and that kind of gear didn't exist, so all of these innovations in gear have happened, and they continue to happen. So as they adapted, you know, Dick slowly started to realize that he was able to buy smaller seed. Yet, in fact, at his old building, he had a land-based upweller and started to buy smaller seed and try to grow it, and was using floating equipment on Grant 3 to start the seed and get it big enough so that he could bottom plant it. The same situation happened with me as I went through, you know, year after year of the struggles of trying to grow subtidally with limited tide windows and inability to access and manage all of the racks. We slowly started to transition into floating gear. In fact, I drove over to Martha's Vineyard and purchased a whole bunch of bags from the Aquina tribe that was growing the tomahawk oyster at the time. And they were growing them in Menemsha Pond. They were mesh bags that had pool noodle floats on the sides, which seems ridiculous, but that was what was available. Those were all actually deployed right in front of Mr. Cosgrove's house, probably around 2005 or 6 is when I did that. So I had floating gear there, I had floating gear on Grant 2, and over time I was able to start to transition the rack system out of the bay. It took years. I applied for a federal grant through EQIP to get rid of all of the rebar racks that were falling apart, leaving an unsafe environment on my farm, and I slowly transitioned and experimented with floating gear. And the reason I did that was because of the limited ability to manage the farm. It's impossible to flip and do a gear swap on subtidal racks when you only have an hour or two to do it. And what ends up happening is you just perpetuate the fouling problem. So slowly over time, probably 6 or 7 renditions of floating gear happened. Different floats were available, styrofoam floats, foam floats of various shapes and sizes. And now we're starting to use a plastic float, a hard plastic float that's kind of been adopted by the industry as the best tool for that job. And, you know, to be honest with you, I brought some of these pictures because there's a lot of discussion about, well, why can't you just do it the way that they used to do it? Well, I did that, and I lost an incredible amount of oysters. Oyster seed has to be big enough to fend off predators. There's been no talk about predators on the bottom. There's been no talk about the fouling that I deal with in Katuitt Bay. We have blue crabs, we have whelks, we have oyster drills, we have green crabs that all eat bottom-planted oysters if they're too small. So you need something to contain them, to grow them big enough to be able to fend those off. And even when you do plant them, you still take a hit with mortality due to predation and bottom conditions. I wanted to just, if you could, Amy, just maybe start with that first picture. This is a condo cage that was in the Narrows, and because of, you know, the use in that area, we've got floating gear and we have condo cages. This is what a condo cage looks like after about a month being underwater. It is completely covered in tunicates and various kinds of sponges. And what that does is it creates an environment. It essentially steals food from the oysters. There's poor growth. You have infestations of barnacles, polydura worms, all sorts of things that make it not a good habitat for an oyster. We'll skip to the next one. That's just another photo of it right there in the Narrows on our grant. Because if you were to walk 10 feet out further on beyond that, you're in 8 feet of water. So I have a very limited area where I can actually access and walk these areas to service them. The next slide, that was oysters that we harvested in May. And if you notice all that green weed, and I'm unfortunately not able to zoom in too much here, but we have a significant amount of mortality on these because they got smothered. And this situation has gotten worse over the years. So I've had to adapt in order to get these oysters in a habitat where they're able to grow and have an oxygen-rich habitat and environment so that there'll be healthy seed before I plant them. That was a drag that was taken in the Narrows. In 2011, I had Diane Murphy from the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, CMAC, who I'm still a board member with, come out and evaluate these sponges. These sponges have proliferated over the years. Apparently it was here in the 60s, late 60s, but it's made a resurgence, and it takes up a huge portion of the bottom in the Narrows specifically. There's also big clusters of boring sponge in there that you can't see in that picture, but I know that that's been documented by one of the Shellfish Committee members, which impacts and I believe I showed Mr. Cosgrove when I went out with him and another neighbor to show him the impacts that I picked a quahog shell up in my hand that was impacted by a boring sponge and literally crumbled it in my hand. It makes it an unusable shellfish. You can't sell it that way. This weed has become more prevalent in the past few years, different forms of Gracilaria. We get waves of this. Some years we get it, some years we don't. The last couple of years we've had it. And this is what a drag looks like when we pull it up off the bottom. Let's skip to the next slide. That's the result of that particular weed dying and smothering the bottom, creating an anaerobic bottom. So now I'm losing my mature oysters on the bottom. So when you look at these pictures, it might not be a big deal to you, but I've had to adapt to these environmental changes. I can't do what Dick Nelson did in the 70s and 80s because it doesn't work. I've had to adapt my business plan and be able to grow shellfish seed and get it to a point where it's healthy enough to fend off at predators and be able to have a marketable product. The pictures that I put in here, I know that the last several pictures showed pictures of my gear wrapped around neighbors' docks. These are pictures taken over the summer. That's in front of Mrs. Tompkins' dock. I purposely have allowed enough space for my 30-foot by 15-foot barge to access to and from around those areas. I don't think any of the boats that are on any of these piers have a 15-foot beam, but my barge does, and we're able to do that. So I feel like there's adequate room in between, and as unfortunate as it was that when that line broke, I was quick to respond over there. I had a conversation with Ms. Tompkins. I apologize for that, but again, we had a full gale that afternoon, so things can happen, but I addressed it immediately. I didn't sit on it. I didn't let it cause any damage, and my uncle was with me. I was at his house, enjoying my afternoon. This is a picture in front of Mr. Cosgrove's house from a different angle. And again, one of the issues of concern was, the proximity to his house and whether or not his grandchildren could swim there, even though he says that it's fecal infested. But he, again, I allowed plenty of access to and from and around this equipment. I purposely made that accessible. I showed him that. We talked about it. My manager, Pete, was with me. We accessed it with our barge, even after multiple conversations over the phone from Mr. Cosgrove about, it being an issue. We adjusted it. We did what I thought was the right thing to move it so he had full access to and from his dock, which currently he does not have a boat. I really tried to educate Mr. Cosgrove. I tried to talk to him about why we're doing this. I raked up samples of the bottom to show him. The picture that he's showing you of one of my employees and I raking, we were probably cleaning off the bottom prior to raking quahogs that we've planted there for 15 plus years, covered in netting, which need to be swept constantly. I know the town has quahog nets. They have to deal with the fouling all the time. So what he was looking at was quahogs, and I'm forced to deal with the issues that are there. I have to rake all that stuff out of the way before I can even break up whatever product's in the ground or on the ground. It's a royal pain in the neck. This area is not just used as a nursery site or an intermediate site for us. We overwinter our seed there because of the depth and because of the protection and because of the lack of ice typically in that area. All of our seed, unlike an intertidal site where you have growers that will pull all of their seed off the flats and store it inside or store it in a warehouse or refrigerated warehouse for the winter, we don't do that because we have the depth. So that the Narrows serves multiple purposes. It's a grow-out area in the summer, and even though there was discussion about can you move it out of the way for 2 months, that's my growing season. That's when I grow the seed. I get the seed, I have to grow it to maturity or get it to a size that's able to, be in a healthy environment during that time. So all of the concerns and some of the math, and some of the, puffing the chest about the permit. Yeah, I was asked for a permit after I was threatened, basically over the phone multiple times, about, the lack of agricultural law and what, if I didn't move equipment, that there would be big problems. So I've dealt with all of that, and I've tried to be as cordial as I can about it. But I'm sorry, I don't feel like I have an obligation to supply people with information that are threatening me. And sure enough, Freedom of Information Act happens, calls friends of mine that I've been in the business with, that I've worked with my entire 20 years. So I know who he's called, and I know, the answer to most of the questions that he posed were answered. This is new equipment. I'm an aquaculture farmer. I grow oysters. I have to adapt and move in the direction that will continue to provide a viable business for me and my employees and my family. And I take great pride in it. I've tried extremely hard over the years to satisfy the concerns of everyone in that bay, not just the folks that have complaints there. I've worked with multiple people over the years. And so to talk about things like the sailing club and, I have worked with them, I educate them on the gear, they are familiar with it. They have literally written letters about the fact that it's not in their way. I have pictures of them sailing through a mooring field with boats. Way more of an obstruction than this. So, and that's what they do all the time. So to say that that's an issue, that one time to me is irrelevant. I feel like this has been a lot of threats, a lot of demands, and although you might, disagree with our process, this is what we've had to adapt to. There were no houses on that shoreline when this business first started, and even into the 70s when Dick Nelson was running the business. And there were docks, there were docks that were contested, for sure. There were threats made by one of those people that I have documentation from the former town manager that I met with in person. He was mad because Dick Nelson opposed his pier that was going to run right through his shellfish grant. So if there's still a problem with that, then I understand, but at the same time, it's been addressed. I have tried to do the best that I can over the years to try to put this equipment in the least obstructive area for all user groups, not just the homeowners, for everybody. I know that it's been evaluated by the Natural Resources Department. I'm assuming the harbor master has driven down there to make sure it's not impeding navigation. And community members that row, kayak, sail, and boat have all written letters of support for my business and have commented on the fact that it is not in their way. So to suggest that it is, I disagree with. And I'll just leave it with that for now.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Good points. Amy, do you have any correspondence from the Waterways Committee regarding this? Did they?
No, so renewal applications are sent to the Recreation Department, to the Shellfish Department, to the Harbor Master, to Shellfish, Natural Resources, all for review and comment. We did not receive any comments from Waterways, nor from the Harbor Master, nor from the Recreation Department with any concerns regarding the renewal.
Okay, thank you. I think, it's one important thing to note is, there's been a lot of talk about expert insight into the waterways or habitat or the effects or impacts or oversight of the shellfish. And I think we should, look to somebody that's sitting at the table that has overseen as a constable the operation there and has not seen an issue with it and has knowledge of the waterways and the conditions where these shellfish are grown. So if there was ever an issue with those types of things, the management that the town provides is an important piece that's left out of the argument.
Yeah. We do have a natural resource officer who's also an aquaculture specialist in recent years that conducts routine gear and boundaries compliance inspections on all sites located within town. To ensure that people are complying with, what they're permitted to use, keeping their gear within the boundaries that they're licensed to have that, and just, again, making sure that, all of the requirements annually for renewal on our end, annual reports, payment, et cetera, are met. And we do have a boisterous shellfish propagation program in this town. We have staff on the water in these areas almost daily. We do routine compliance checks on any given day while on patrol. And if we ever see anything that looks out of the ordinary to us, we address it at that time. over the years that I've worked for the town, starting in 2006 as a seasonal employee with the Shellfish program, have seen growth of floating gear, but nor my predecessor, Shellfish Constable Doug Calwett, nor myself has seen what we would consider egregious or exponential expansion within a short period of time. We also keep open relations with all of the growers who need to implement different types of gears as they battle environmental change throughout the decades. I was born and raised in this town and has seen the environment change a lot in my 43 years. And so, I at no point in time in my tenure had seen the operations of Cotuit Oyster Company to warrant further review. Because none of the growth seemed egregious or exponential to the people who are out there every day.
Okay, thank you. Any other comment from the public? Mr. Caruso, yeah. If you could have a seat and just talk into the microphone, please.
Good afternoon.
State your name.
Afternoon.
Right, state your
Paul
name.
Caruso.
Please. Yes.
Marston's Mills. I've been a waterman in this town since 1951. I've seen a hell of a lot of changes. I went out of Prince Cove at the age of 14 when I was old enough to sleep in the back of my buddy's truck while we went fishing for bluefish. Been a commercial fisherman, a recreational fisherman, fisheries biologist for the Commonwealth for 27 years. Shellfish Advisory, Concom, you name it, I've been there. Just like Chris said, things have changed. They've changed in a big way, and he's done a great job at adapting to those changes to maintain a viable operation. He's got a great operation. It's nice, clean, neat. We know where everything is. I boat through there regularly on a daily basis sometimes. No problems with any of his gear. I know where it is. I fish around it all the time. You might see some of my flies stuck to his gear. That's about as bad as it's going to get. I'll just leave it with two brief quotes. One is, aquaculture provides a public benefit for everyone in this room. They call it Offsville for a reason. They've been raising oysters not only on Chris's grants, formerly Dick's grant, but over at Crosby's grant way over on the other side of the bay, over in West Bay. The problem has become, as Chris has noted and Amy's noted, the water quality has degraded. The bottom is not the bottom we had 50 years ago. If you don't get that stuff off the bottom, the predators are going to kill you, the fouling going to kill you. We have grassolaria, like you can't believe how many places are just wiped out. Grassolaria, boring sponges, sea lettuce now coming down the Marston's Mills River, all because of nutrients. Oysters are a great way to get nutrients out of the water, and you're not going to raise them unless you get them up off the bottom. It's just impossible. The last thing I'll say is boating, like I said, not an issue. Trying to think of what I had to say. If those dock and pier conflicts, I don't see any conflict. If you're a boater and you can't get a boat off that dock and pier without hitting that stuff, you don't belong in a boat. You better go back on land and play golf or something. That's about it. It's way past my lunch time, and now we are on PM.
Okay.
Like your first comment was, good afternoon. It's morning. That was morning. It's now afternoon, so I'm going to go home. But anybody has any questions? I also consulted for aquaculturists in the past, and I have a private consulting firm now. I'm not here beating my own drum for business. Chris doesn't need me. He's doing a great job. But I would tell any aquaculturist the exact same thing Chris has done. You have to adapt to your conditions of what sites you have. Chris is not going to get any more grants out of this town. So he's stuck with what he has, and he's doing a great job at raising a nice product for all of us to enjoy. I'm going home to eat oysters.
Thank you.
Nice talking.
Thank you. Any other public comment, please? Chris?
Thank you very much. Chris Clark. I'm a town of Barnstable resident and current town councilor for Precinct 11, former town council liaison to the Shellfish Committee, and a current supervisor to the Cape Cod Conservation District. I was formerly employed by the town of Barnstable in the 1990s and 2000s, working with natural resources, then worked for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and private aquaculture. I have known Chris Gargiulo through his operations, and he has always been a respectful and responsible businessman in Cotuit. He has done so legally and faithfully over the years. I am proud of his personal and professional investment over the decades, and not only in our town, but especially in the village of Katuitt. He delivers a world-renowned product, providing local jobs, and his farm also provides environmental benefits to Katuitt Bay. Chris has been, to my knowledge, a former member of the Katuitt Civic Association, a board member of the Massachusetts Aquaculture Association, is considered in the industry a leader in the Commonwealth in aquaculture. And he also reminded me that he's a board member of CMAQ, which is the Southeastern Massachusetts Aquaculture Center. Thank you. His renewal application reflects the changes over time in Katuitt Bay, with our ever-declining water quality and the degradation of habitat, shellfish habitat, along with changes in aquaculture growing methods. Floating gear is now part of our industry standard, depending on water quality and tides, with biofouling management number one concern, especially regarding subtidal growing and intertidal growing. I did work for 13 years as a shellfish farm manager for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and I'll confess that I was not able to operate a shellfish business as effectively as Chris has done in a similarly challenging subtidal habitat. Aquaculture is and has been included in our town's comprehensive wastewater management plan as a tool in the toolbox to mitigate the town's nitrogen loading in this watershed, addressing the water quality degradation as identified by the lawsuit filed by the Conservation Law Foundation. I contend that if there was no aquaculture in our town, especially on the south side of town, the water quality and shellfish habitat would probably likely be a lot worse than it is now. We also have had people speak at town council meetings to support the town's working waterfronts, and I don't think we do enough to support the people who have made their living on the water, providing jobs and celebrating our maritime culture. Considering that a business that has been pre-existing for almost a century should have equal standing with 10 current waterfront property owners does not strike me as very reasonable as mitigation partners. I trust the careful oversight of the Marine and Environmental Affairs Division and our town's hearing process, and I support this aquaculture license renewal.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Harryhauser, could I just have 1 minute in rebuttal? I'll keep it very short.
Sure.
So when we began our presentation, we said that we weren't here to put Katuitt Oyster out of business or even to cause it any harm, but we were here to express our concerns. We made a case that there have been significant changes in operation and changes in the intensity, and we asked the town, and we said, this is deserving of your review and consideration of reasonable conditions to address these changes. And this is a 10-year renewal process, so after this happens, there's a 10-year period that my clients have to live with. So it's a serious proposition. It's also a wonderful opportunity to take a look at this. So I listened to the applicant, Attorney Gargiulo, and he espoused the same attitude that essentially brought my clients to this table today. We're regulated by agencies. We have the right by statute to do this. We need to change gear. Your concerns don't matter. I listened to Mr. Gargiulo, the applicant. He confirmed there have been significant changes in conditions, both in the environment, in the methods of growing the clams and the oysters, changes in gear and changes in methods. He's essentially confirming what our case was. That's our case. There's been significant change. So what does that do? Why are we here with the town's authority? My clients have concerns. They've expressed them. The applicant disagrees. The applicant says he unilaterally has taken it into his own hands to say, I've done the best I can. In my opinion, it's okay. Well, that puts it in the town's purview. I do land use for a living. I know Attorney Conley, we work with each other often. I'm often representing clients in front of conservation commissions, zoning boards, planning boards, et cetera. And there's always different interests at play, and the town is the arbiter of those. The town has to take it all into account and try to do what's fair and reasonable for all the parties. And that's what we're asking here. And the comment about we're regulated by all these state agencies, that's not why we're here. We're here because the town of Barnstable, exercising its authority under the Home Rule Amendment, has adopted local regulations to have local control over this, and that's what we're asking you to do. And our suggestion is that the changes in the business are so substantial that they now exhibit all the characteristics of the two decisions in 2007, which resulted in denial of applications. He's transformed to that point where if this were 2007, if you acted consistently, you would deny these. We're asking you to take a look at this. We're asking you to review it. We're asking you to consider conditions that are fair to both parties. And I've said in my presentation and in my letter, setbacks from properties, setbacks from docks, changes in location, or some sort of ascertainable standard. So it's not the applicant saying, I need to change to above water gear. I'm going to put it where I think it's best. And yeah, those people up there, they don't like it, but I've determined it's okay. That's where the town, as the arbiter of the regulations and the enforcer, has to step in and do what's fair to everyone. And that's all we're asking. We're not asking to put him out of business. We're not calling him a bad guy like we've been called. We're simply asking for fairness. That's all.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, yeah, if you can, yeah, just
Yes,
be
very
brief.
quickly, the notion that the right to farm is a blanket right is fiction. It's not even the zip code are correct. One. Two, you hear the word adapt, adapt, adapt. We're saying the same thing. We understand that it's a hard business, backbreaking work. You've got to adapt to the environment that you're in. But the environment includes other people. It includes us. And when you guys talk about, well, we can get around the boats, you guys are among the best boat operators probably on the planet Earth. But it's all the rest of the people that are out there that have to live with these challenges that are created. For example, when you have one row, as you have, and a person's got to go left or they got to go right. But in going left or right, they're forced right into the traffic of the expressway, what I call the expressway, and the narrows. It is, I agree, for you guys, a piece of cake. It's not for everybody else. Adapting doesn't mean I can do it every way that's perfect for me. It means I adapt the way it works best for me, but I got to adapt and recognize others. And we've heard nothing, not a scintilla of recognition of adapting to the rest of us who have to live with it. Finally, on the federal licenses, it seems abundantly fair that if the company has what the town told us they don't have and what the company previously refused to tender, if we could please see the actual license with the conditions and the map. Without that, it is legally irresponsible and it is impossible to assess whether or not the company is in compliance with it. They may be in perfect compliance with it. What do they get to hide? If I had a license and I'm perfectly in compliance with it, that's where it would be. It'd be up on the screen. We're not asking for much. So it seems abundantly fair that they be required to give us that today so that we can review it and analyze it if, in fact, they have it. If they don't, you're being asked to make a decision in a complete vacuum. An entire element of their obligation would be unavailable to you to determine compliance. Thank you very much.
I believe they have everything that they need, but we do have a permit, and it is covering grants 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7. Correspondence from the Army Corps of Engineers confirms that. So
Is that
I
something
don't know.
that, I think we've already, have we provided that to the town?
When the initial Freedom of Information Act request came in, we went through what we had in Mr. Gargiulo's file for Katuitt Oyster Company and provided it. At the time, we did not have a copy of the Army Corps permit. So after that sort of, chain of events took place. I requested it through Christine Jasek at Army Corps, and she provided it to me along with an email detailing that Army Corps is of the opinion that he's operating well within what he is permitted to do.
Excuse me.
So you do.
Including the use of that gear.
Yeah, excuse me, please. We spoke to the same person subsequent to the town speaking to them. The Army Corps sent to us a letter of permission, as was demonstrated. That's not the permit. The letter of permission explicitly states that attached is your permit with conditions.
One
And that's
second,
what we're
so
asking.
let me just talk 1 second. So I have a letter here from the U.S. Army Corps that states, the letter of permission at the end of the PDF should be referenced as the main permit. The other documents in the attached PDF are just the confirmation letter that the project met the letter of permission and was authorized. So that's a letter from the Army Corps here. So the letter of permission should be referenced as the main permit. That's from the U.S. Army Corps.
Well,
I'm going off of that.
There's going to be a continuance, so we'll
Right.
take a look at that
Right.
in the interim.
Okay.
Just for the record, in speaking with the same person who wrote that letter, the acknowledgement we got is that there is a separate document. It sets specific terms and conditions and has a map. And it's really very simple. If the company has it, they shouldn't have any reluctance to provide it. If all the company has is a letter of permission, they don't have the documents we need.
This isn't discovery. We're not responding to him.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you, everybody, for the testimony. It's a lengthy shellfish aquaculture renewal. We'll take all of everybody's testimony into consideration, and we'll continue the hearing to a date certain. What's that?
Yeah, can you pick a date?
Right, it'll be, what, 30 days or more? How much time do you need to review this, right?
Well, with the holidays and everything, 30 days sounds about right. That'd be great.
Right. Okay, so today is the 13th, the 12th, sorry, so we'll pick January, well, let's see, gotta go through. Right, yeah. There's a lot that goes into scheduling these. 13th is a Saturday, so
The 10th? This is a Wednesday.
sure, January 10th?
Same time.
Yes, sir.
In this room?
We'll do it in this room, 10:30. If we can, we'll see, we'll make sure it's available. We have to, it's a lot that goes into, like I said, so we'll tentatively schedule it for 10:30. If there's a change that needs to be made, we'll do that. But yeah, as long as everybody's schedules can fit.
So it remains open and we can submit more information in advance of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you, are you agreeing to help in the process of trying to get our hands on this critical permit, which they claim they have? Maybe you could be.
Yes, sir. If you've submitted a public records request, we can provide what we have.
Well, we've done that. Right. We've done that.
You've done that, so we can provide what we have, right?
Okay, but if the COC has it and you don't, isn't that a circle?
Well, when we have it, if we don't have whatever they have, we can confer with them. If we don't have that documentation, we'll get it from them for sure.
Excellent, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Looking ahead, that time should work. The tide's quite late in the day
Good.
on January 10th.
Very good. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll continue to January 10th. See you then.